Thanks very much, Nigel. As this is my first time to take the floor here, I would like to start by saying a big thank you to the organizers, to the Pontifical Academies. In a very personal way, it's very meaningful for me to be here. And I cannot express my gratitude on that level. And the second way, it's also for me to be able to share to the Pontifical Academies some of the experiences that we've had trying to build in institutionally a respect for Indigenous knowledge systems in the work that we do. And so I'm sharing these experiences with you and with everyone in the room in the hope that these might mobilize and catalyze the sort of the operationalization of the respect for climate knowledge, the knowledge needed for climate action. So I'm going to be talking about experiences at the GCF. What is the GCF? The GCF is the Green Climate Fund. And if you don't know what it is, it's a multilateral fund. It's the largest climate fund in the world. And it was set up by the UNFCCC and serves the Paris Agreement. Its mandate is to support developing countries make the transition to a low-emission, climate-resilient society. As a hub for climate finance, what can we say about the GCF portfolio in regards to Indigenous peoples? And I'm sharing some preliminary headline figures, but we had a look at the portfolio, and what we can say is that when GCF is working in 129 countries, 83 of these countries have projects and activities financed by GCF that affect Indigenous people, so 64% of the portfolio. In terms of financing, it means 27% of GCF financing is in projects that have the potential to affect Indigenous people. So this is $3.6 billion. And so that has a lot of implications. And I'm using the term affect quite deliberately because it means there's an opportunity to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples. It also means that these projects could also pose risk to Indigenous peoples, hence the need for very careful safeguarding and promotion of their inclusion. And so what are then the structures and instruments by which we safeguard and ensure Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems are promoted at the Green Climate Fund and in the operations that we do? Now, structurally and institutionally, what we have are four sort of instruments or institutions by which we can achieve that. The first is that in 2018, the GCF board adopted the Indigenous Peoples Policy. And as a policy, it sets out the objectives of what we need to do, which is to, in very basic terms, make sure our project activities do no harm and promote good. We have a scope of application, and that means that we try to say, okay, it's an Indigenous Peoples Policy, but it applies to certain groups. And I think I've heard discussions, okay, what then is a definition of Indigenous people? So at the Green Climate Fund, we have a very broad scope of application, which takes into account issues of self-determination, relationship to collective relationships to land and resources, language, and crucially, it doesn't relate to an official definition of Indigenous peoples at the national level. We have requirements. So the policy sets out a list of things that people or institutions that want to access GCF finance must do. And this includes consultation with Indigenous peoples and the application of free, prior, and informed consent processes. So we also have, and as an institution, the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. This is a very important institution at the GCF Fund because it's composed entirely of Indigenous peoples who've been selected through their own nomination process. So as a secretariat, we don't appoint, nominate. It's through the regional processes that they nominate who they want to represent themselves at the GCF. And the mandate of this group is to provide advice. Advice at a very operational level, which means being able to talk to secretariat staff, to the different program officers, and become a sounding board, if you like, for issues that arise when it comes to Indigenous peoples. They also are able to provide advice, and the board is able to consult them on issues related to Indigenous peoples. So there's a formal institution, and this is very important for the legitimacy of the decisions we try to take in relation to Indigenous peoples and their knowledge. Another institution that is very important, even though maybe the weakest link for me, it's ensuring that there's staff. In an institution, you need dedicated staff to work on Indigenous knowledge. It's not Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems. It's an area of expertise almost, and we find as Indigenous peoples in many institutions that they tend to be folded into all sorts of inclusion areas. So you would have staff that work on gender, youth, and Indigenous peoples all at the same time. Whereas it's really very crucially important when you begin to have serious work on Indigenous peoples and promoting the space for their knowledge to really have dedicated staff like they do at the CBD. Finally, you also need Indigenous spaces. So spaces where Indigenous organizations can self-organize, can form and can lobby governance institutions. And at the Green Climate Fund, they do this through the Observer Network. What they've done is they've taken the CSO Observer Network and sort of share the space with CSOs and Indigenous peoples. So when we look at these institutions, what can we say in regards to then how they look and then promote knowledge? They become a framework. So what was interesting, and I said before that we've got general objectives in the policy that talk about do no harm and do good. One of the specific objectives of the policy is to, and I'll read out in a quick paraphrase, is to promote the positive contributions and leaderships of Indigenous peoples in climate change adaptation and mitigation based on their traditional knowledge systems, livelihoods, and practices in a manner that is accessible, rights-based, gender-responsive, culturally appropriate, and inclusive. So by having that policy, we're able to try and articulate sort of the aims that we want the financing to be. We also, through having all these institutions, as I've said, we are a body set up by the UNFCCC, which means the Conference of Parties or the governments give periodic guidance to the GCF. And what we've been seeing over the last few years is that the COP has actually made a point almost to always focus on ensuring that GCF itself respects Indigenous knowledge. So therefore, I'm not going to go through this text, but what is important to note is that that the conference parties, the governments, are saying to GCF, when you do your climate financing, you need to ensure Indigenous knowledge is there alongside science. When you're developing funding proposals, you need to incorporate Indigenous peoples and local communities' interests, perspectives, and knowledge, and you need to ensure inclusion of Indigenous peoples. So with this framework, and I've said we have about 27% of our portfolio on Indigenous of what projects that could affect Indigenous peoples. And I have here a list of, I was going to go through some, but I'll just pick up on this one because I think this is a very interesting case study. As you know, in the First Nations of Australia have a tradition of managing wildfires in the savanna regions. And this is, they've been doing this for millennia, and in an era of climate change, there's been an increase in wildfire. And so what they do, and they explain this very clearly, is that the First Nation communities still continue to do what they've always needed to do to care for their country and for their land. And they've worked with scientists and trying to use the latest technologies to increase the efficiency of that. They've also then looked at this opportunity to say, okay, if we can reduce the GHG emissions caused by wildfires by burning earlier in the season, by managing it, maybe we can also, get support through the carbon markets for our traditional knowledge. So they then went and tried to develop, different ways of verifying their emissions. They worked again with all these scientists to come up with a very robust way of proving that traditional fire management reduces GHG caused by wildfires. And what makes it very interesting then is that they didn't stop there. They then said, well, we think we can export this knowledge. And so now Indigenous peoples in Australia are working with governments in Zambia, Botswana, Mozambique, Angola, Belize, and Guatemala to export this knowledge. So you have Indigenous peoples not just leading in terms of trying to benefit from climate finance, but also leading the development in the South. And I think this is you need to actually say, okay, this is a very interesting thing, and how do we get more projects like this supported further? So we've got other projects under the RED results-based program, and as well in classic adaptation work. But I wanted to just reflect a little bit quickly on what's next in terms of climate finance and Indigenous peoples. When I showed the initial slide earlier about how many projects impact Indigenous peoples, what I couldn't show you was how much of that money actually goes to Indigenous peoples, because the data is for many reasons, it's impossible to find. And Indigenous peoples are saying very concretely, if you can't figure out how much financing goes to Indigenous peoples, then give financing directly to Indigenous peoples so that Indigenous peoples can prove that our actions deserve financing and support. And so there's been an increasing move across the multilateral finance systems to try and enhance the access of Indigenous peoples and communities to finance. At the Adaptation Fund, they've now in their medium-term strategy, they're expanding their modalities in terms of locally led adaptation to engage what they call local and vulnerable groups. They recently created a Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. There's now a target, an aspirational target of 20% to go directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And at the Loss and Damage Fund, which was being set up, they have also within their governing instruments very interesting sort of avenues to try and have direct access grants for communities and Indigenous peoples, and also for ensuring that Indigenous peoples can engage in the governance as well. At the GCF itself, we have a strategic plan that covers the period of 2024 to 2027. And I just want to quickly flash this on the screen, but just to show that there are entry points for Indigenous and local knowledge as well at the GCF under its new strategic plan. And I think this is a very interesting area because you can see multilateral financing is slowly responding to these calls for more rapid access to financing. So, and I'm just going to end by talking about the idea of inclusion. So when you talk about access, inclusion, and promotion of Indigenous knowledge, what are some of the things that are needed? First, you start with recognition, and then you can see this year, you can see in the Laudato Si that there's how do you build from recognition of the need to dialogue with Indigenous peoples. That one point I wanted to make, that you also need to then acknowledge in this recognition the historical and ongoing tensions and inequalities that continue to persist when it comes to Indigenous peoples and the issues that they raise. I want to acknowledge as well in this recognition the role of Indigenous peoples activism and the global solidarity that is built around Indigenous peoples. We would not have gotten to this space without the work of people like Vicky, like Myrna, and then continuously like Hindu, advocating and really pushing forward the boundaries. We need instruments, and I talked about the need for policies, for staff, and for advisory groups. And these are all there, and there's been a history of groups. For a science academy, you might want to look at the IPBES, for example. A lot of examples of discussions around validation, for example, that's been discussed hugely in the initial formation of IPBES, as well as definitions of indigenous peoples. And finally, the dialogue doesn't stop with one workshop. You need to continue to bring together these diverse voices. As you can see from these last 2 days, there's so much when it comes to indigenous knowledge in terms of the perspectives, the areas of work, and the areas of synergies that can take place at the global, at the local, and at different levels. So that's it. That's my little contribution. If you wanted more information about the work of the GCF and Indigenous peoples, I've put up the link there, and then you can always get in touch with me at the email. I'm also the focal point for Indigenous peoples, so if there are any issues with GCF projects, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.